Hello, friends, and welcome to this channel. My name is Nonya, and I am your real estate tutoress. On this channel, I bring the best tips and tools to getting your real estate license. I also answer any questions you may have about the process. If you're new here, welcome, and do consider subscribing. Now, today we're going to go into some vocabulary words. And before we jump in, so it's a few of them, not a lot. Before we jump into the vocabulary, what I wanted to mention is don't memorize every single word. Like, don't memorize the definition word for word, but understand the concept. So, for example, if I'm talking to you and I say, "Oh, I'm getting into real estate," you know what I mean. I don't have to go there and say, your brain isn't starting going to start doing, well, real estate is land and the attached property and this and that and that. But in your brain, you kind of know what I'm talking about. So when you begin to know these words, where if someone uses it in a sentence or you see it in the scenario and you know what they're talking about, that's when you kind of know that you know what we're talking about and you understand the vocabulary. All right, so that hope that makes sense, and I will try in as I talk about the words to make them applicable to you and give you things that will help you remember what the words are, so you're not cramming or memorizing each particular word. All right, so without further ado, let's get into the vocabulary. Grab something to write with and grab your notebook, and let's get started. First word is alienation. So think of the word alien, right? So something that is not part of you. So think about it like, let's say you own the property and the property was yours, like part of you, and now you are separating yourself from the property. So you are alienating yourself from that property. So that's alienation. With alienation, we have involuntary alienation and voluntary alienation. So, first, we're going to talk about voluntary alienation. With voluntary alienation, think of the word voluntary. You're doing this out of your own free will. No one's forcing you to alienate yourself from this property. So this is where you're selling the property or gifting it to someone, to an organization, whatever. So you are voluntarily transferring your ownership from one person, from you to the next person. Okay? Now when it is involuntary, this is where it is against your free will. And it could be, like it says on the screen, bankruptcy, foreclosure, or adverse possession. With bankruptcy, we won't really go into that because that's, a different industry. And if you have real estate, it could be part of that process. And you may have to sell your house as part of the bankruptcy. But with foreclosure, this is a property that you've defaulted on your loan. And so the lender is going to sell your property to help hopefully get their money back. So foreclosure, the home is being sold to recoup the money if you default on your loan. In the state of Illinois, we have what's called judicial foreclosure. With judicial foreclosure, property is foreclosed through the authorization of the court. So you always need court authorization to foreclose on property in the state of Illinois. All right. So foreclosure, someone's property is being sold because they are defaulting on their loan, and the lender essentially wants to make their money back. And then the lender must go through the court system to get approval to sell the property to get their money back. Adverse possession. This is another involuntary alienation where it's not your choice to lose that property, right? But it's happening. And two of the examples here are number one, squatters' rights. So adverse possession, someone is living in your home, or someone is using your land without your permission. Let's say they get a RV and put it on your piece of land without your permission. And they are there for the prescribed amount of time. In Illinois, it's 20 years. So they're there for up to 20 years. After 20 years, they could file and get rights of ownership to your real estate. And that would be considered adverse possession. Another way adverse possession could happen is eminent domain. Now, if you don't remember what that is, let's do a quick refresher here. This is one of the governmental powers where the government has the right, okay? The right of the government, not the actual process, but the right of the government to take personal or private property for public use. So, for example, they need to build highways, but there isn't really a path for that highway. And so they will create a path and tell all those homeowners that, hey, sorry, we got to buy your house out and build a highway there. Or if you are familiar with O'Hare Airport here in Chicago, there was a time they were expanding the airport. And so they exercised eminent domain, and that was the government's right to do so. Client. A client is the person who has authorized you as their agent to represent them, in this case, in a real estate transaction, right? So the client is the one who hired you to represent them or gave you authorization to represent them. Okay, looking at it from the broker perspective, from the realtor perspective, this is the person you're working for. It's the person you're negotiating for. This is the person that you are writing an offer for. This is the person that you are showing homes to. This is the person that hopefully you have a brokerage agreement with. And that's our next vocabulary term, brokerage agreement. With this brokerage agreement, it's an employment contract. So it could be with the buyer or it could be with the seller who is your client. In this contract, it will stipulate the terms, how long you guys are working together, any kind of compensation that you're getting, and the duties that you'll be performing to them, as well as any obligations they have to you. Now, in the brokerage agreement, remember I said it's between either the buyer or the seller and the brokerage, the office, the sponsoring broker. Remember, it's with the sponsoring broker and not you, the realtor. At the end of this video, I will link a video I did on brokerage agreements. And so you can go through that and learn. It goes into so much detail about brokerage agreements. So when you're working with a seller, that's called a listing agreement. All right. So the brokerage agreement is between buyer and seller. Now, if you want to talk about the one that's just with the seller, that's your listing agreement, your employment contract. It stipulates the services you'll be providing to the seller and their obligations to you as their agent. Okay. Again, it's with the sponsoring broker and it will either name you as the seller's designated agent or it may not. It just depends on how your contract is written. Types of listing agreements. There's your exclusive right to sell, exclusive agency listing agreement, open listing agreement, and net listing. For the exam in Illinois, remember that all exclusive brokerage agreements, all exclusive listing agreements, and all exclusive buyer agency agreements must be in writing. So any exclusive agreement must be in writing. Because what the exclusive agreement is saying is that this seller or this buyer is only working with this particular brokerage, and the brokerage will be compensated if they bring a buyer. So with a listing agreement, the rights to sell is the brokerage gets compensated regardless of who brings the buyer. With exclusive agency, the brokerage will only be compensated if they're the ones who bring a buyer. Open listing, this is not exclusive. The seller will work with any agent or any brokerage that brings them a buyer. And net listing, the seller will work with you and your commission will be whatever is left after the seller takes home the amount that they want. So for example, the seller wants to take home $50,000. And at the end of the day, they're left with $55,000, right? So they give you five and they go home with 50. Okay. Hopefully you get this in writing so that there's no argument at the closing table. Let me give you an example of the right to sell. Let's say that you enter into an exclusive right to sell agreement with a seller. You put the property on the market. 3 days later, the seller's best friend is like, "Oh, you're selling your house. I wish you told me." Uh, my cousin always loved your house, and my cousin wants to buy it. Now, what the seller will have to do is the seller will tell him, well, tell your cousin to call my agent, and we'll talk from there. And even if that cousin buys the house, right, the agent will get compensated. If you listen to the story, they didn't find the buyer, but because they have an exclusive right to sell, they will get compensated. Now, same scenario, let's go to the exclusive agency. For exclusive agency, in that scenario, the seller could just be like, "Oh, really? Your cousin is interested in my house? Sure. That they can come see it, and if they make an offer and accept it, yeah, I can sell it to them." And then the seller can do that, and the agent does not get compensated. Buyer agency agreement. Now, this is the agreement with the sponsoring broker and the buyer. And you, as the realtor, you, as the agent, will be working with this buyer. So you'll be assigned to the buyer as their designated agent. There are three types of buyer agency agreements: your exclusive buyer agency agreement, exclusive agency buyer agency agreement, and your open buyer agency agreement. Remember, exclusives must be in writing. So, your exclusive buyer agency agreement says, I am working with you, buyer, my buyer, and regardless of who finds the property, I will get compensated. So, if the buyer finds a property for sale by owner, the agent will still be compensated. Exclusive agency buyer agency agreement. The buyer is only working with one realtor. Remember, it's exclusive. And the realtor, real estate agent, will be compensated only if they are the ones who help this buyer find a property. So, in the same scenario, if this buyer finds a property for sale by owner, contacts the owner, buys the home directly from the owner, the realtor or agent will not be compensated. All right. And as you can tell, it's similar to the listing ones that are also exclusive. Open buyer agency agreement, similar to open listing. This buyer is working with any agent that will find them a home. So they may have five realtors sending them properties, and whichever one they see and they like, they see it with the agent and they get compensated. The agent will get compensated if they're the ones that find this buyer home. All right, let's wrap this up with a question. Broker John sees an ad in a local newspaper that a seller is offering property for sale by owner with a 3% fee to any broker who brings in a buyer. Alex asks the seller if he can show the property to a buyer. What type of listing has the seller offered? What type of listing has the seller offered? So we look at the options: exclusive agency listing agreement, exclusive right to sell listing agreement, net listing, open listing. With this, if you don't already know the answer, you could eliminate the ones that are not correct and you're left with the answer. So it doesn't talk about any minimum amount that the seller needs to get. So C is out, it's not a net listing. Next, is this an exclusive listing agreement? Is this seller only working with one brokerage? The answer is no. So we can eliminate both exclusive listing agreements, and we're left with D as in dog as our answer. So in this situation, the seller, all right, the seller is saying, I will compensate whoever brings me a buyer. I am not entering into any relationship with any brokerage, but if you bring me a buyer, I will compensate you. And that is an example of an open listing. All right, so that was all of the vocabulary for today. Hopefully, you gained something from that and it helped you as you prepare, not just with these words, but as you do more vocabulary words. Hopefully, you will use some of these techniques that I taught in here to help you learn those words so that when you come across them on the exam, you're able to answer the questions. All right, because you will see scenario questions on the exam, you will see places where they will tell you some story and you're supposed to know that they're talking about, for example, eminent domain or alienation, like we talked about in the vocabulary. All right, so much success to you. jump onto this brokerage agreement video and learn more about brokerage agreements. And I will see you in the next video.